wonderful to see such a crowd on such a beautiful evening. The last time I was in this town was a few weeks after Tropical Storm Irene. My publisher didn't talk to God and schedule the tour properly, so we wound up coming down single-lane dirt roads with high water signs on either side, and we weren't sure how many weeks we were going to spend here after that talk, but it's wonderful to be back on such an occasion. I want to talk tonight about how we used to settle political debates. I think of Hamilton and Burr whenever I'm watching the presidential primary debates and thinking, well, yes, we are trying to choose this commander-in-chief, somebody who shoots straight and asks questions afterwards sometimes. But we seem so much more civilized in that time. Dueling was a very old tradition. It had its own code of conduct that came out of Spain, the Code Duel. It was so commonplace in the 18th century that when Tobias Smollett tried to make it to the French Riviera from England, he didn't get very far each day without seeing people tumbling out of taverns and trying to kill each other. He comments on it in his travels. It wasn't always just, we will see politicians. Young officers seem to earn their spurs, so to speak, by eliminating the competition. Naval officers especially, confined on ships, could find the slightest infraction or the slightest challenge to their honor answerable only to a duel. I think dueling really picked up in this country when the French joined the United States to fight against the English. So we were mere students at that time. The colonists didn't shoot each other very often. But one of our signers of the Declaration of Independence didn't last very long. Button Gwinnett was killed in a duel. And they were so common that across the street from Independence Hall, which was the Pennsylvania State House then, there was a field with trees left to obscure the sight, so that when congressmen had disagreements, they could just go across the street and settle things. And people like Alexander Hamilton took lessons, literally, from the French, acting as their seconds, learning how the system worked. And it's really remarkable to me that more of them weren't killed. I'm not going to give any lessons tonight in how to do it, but it was a very strict code. It had to be done exactly according to the rules. You had to have the seconds chosen. You had to have the doctor nearby. You didn't have to kill anybody, but you were taking a risk if you didn't, as we will see. So I want to start out with our hero and our victim, Alexander Hamilton. And our hero and the culprit, I guess, although at the time he thought he won, Aaron Burr. Now, what would drive them to fight each other to the death? Aaron Burr was Vice President of the United States at the time of the duel. He was our first vice presidential marksman, you might say, if you remember more recent history. Alexander Hamilton might have become President of the United States. He's really the man that designed the modern American system. He was the founder of the corporation. The first corporation in the United States is the United States. And he was the first Secretary of the Treasury who came up with our banking system, our manufacturing system, just about every modern system, in 120 days, because that's all his boss would give him. George Washington gave him a deadline. So he created the modern system in 120 days. But anybody who's had the smartest kid in class too long, too close, can appreciate the situation of other people around Alexander Hamilton. Congress wouldn't even let him into the room with his ideas. He had to hand his reports, as they were called, to a clerk to read behind closed doors. He got on people's nerves. When he was at Elizabethtown Academy, he would study his Greek and his Latin out loud, pacing and reading from his cards while other people were studying. Seems like a small thing. When the revolution came along, he dropped out of what is now Columbia. It was King's College then. He had flunked math, the first Secretary of the Treasury. How far back do our problems go? Because he flunked math, he couldn't go to medical school. Go figure. But he learned logarithms, and that's what you need for artillery. And so when the war began, he took his debating society, his literary and debating society of other students, and they actually attacked the cannon of the British at Fort George and stole them in the middle of the night. Very, very daring. And he actually is the founder of the oldest military unit in the United States, the 3rd Artillery. So a daring young officer. Other officers were awed by him. He walked along with Washington's retreating army through Princeton. And one of the other officers described it as, he walked along, this little man with a hat down over his face, patting the cannon as if it were a pet dog. But with 2 of those pet dogs, he managed to keep the British Army at bay so that Washington could escape across New Jersey. So he was a bona fide war hero. He became aide-de-camp and legal officer for Washington. He hungered for danger. So he led the last charge in Yorktown, up over a redoubt, on the shoulders of a bigger man with a saber. The Hessians were so freaked out, they just, forget it, drop their weapons. So that's the kind of personality we're dealing with. He met Aaron Burr when the 2 of them clerked with the same lawyer who only had 1 set of books. So I think the story begins to pick up a little as we see Hamilton, Burr. Oh, did I mention? Women duel too. This is an illustration, a cartoon of 2 women settling a dispute in France at the time. And women would go on, but they were using Colt 44s later along. Here's Alexander Hamilton's wife, Betsy. He pursued her. Her father was the commanding general of the Northern Department, number 2 in the American Army, General Philip Schuyler. And Hamilton wanted to marry the wife of somebody with money and power. He didn't make much of a secret of it. When in the wintertime during the Revolution, Martha Washington would come up from Mount Vernon and run the cotillions, as well as the field hospitals for people with smallpox. But she set the social agenda. And she saw Hamilton pursuing the ladies who came to the dances that the officers had so frequently that she named a tomcat that was wandering around Hamilton. So he already had a reputation before the revolution was over. And after his feats of heroism in the fighting, he had to settle down, and so he went to Albany, the home of General Schuyler, his father-in-law. And he studied law with oh, we're going the wrong way, I think. This gentleman. Now, if anybody knows the story of Ethan Allen, I'm not going to pursue that. This was the antagonist of Ethan Allen in the Green Mountain Boys. His name was James Duane. He was known in New York at the time as Swivel Eyes because he made his money as a collection lawyer. But he invested wisely, chose the right side in any quarrel, and wound up mayor of New York City after the Revolution. And as such, Hamilton and Burr clerked underneath him. So you can imagine them tugging the books away from each other. Burr came from a more socially distinguished background than Hamilton. Hamilton legally was considered illegitimate. His mother had left his father, who would have been called an abusive husband these days, and the divorce would have been granted without any problem, but there was no legal divorce on the island of Nevis where Hamilton was born. So his mother just went away with Hamilton to another island, which meant he was going from England to Denmark in a small boat. From island to island, you had different laws. So he grew up under Danish law, but he was illegitimate. Now, but it's important to understand that when he grew up, there was no United States. So he was technically qualified to become president of the United States. In fact, our first American president was John Tyler in 1840. All the others before that were born under a different government, a different time. But that was one of the things Burr would not forget about Hamilton. He felt he was illegitimate in fact and illegitimate under the Constitution. They didn't get along. To open his legal business, Hamilton decided to go to New York City. This is 1785. There were 35 lawyers in New York City, 1785. Can you imagine New York City with only 35 lawyers? They'd be very rich today. But Hamilton did not have enough money, and the next thing Burr did was demand that someone co-sign for him for the rent. So Hamilton's wife had to put up security for him to open up a legal practice. Hamilton wasn't too thrilled about that. They took different paths politically. Hamilton, of course, was a Federalist, as was Washington. And Burr attached himself to Jefferson and Madison. That is, he attached himself to Jefferson until Jefferson thought he was his running mate for vice president, and the Electoral College tied, and Burr said, "I'm not your running mate, I'm your opponent for president." So it took 35 votes of the House of Representatives before Jefferson was finally declared the winner. Burr would not back down. So what Burr did in New York City basically was found what would become a rather notorious political club, Tammany Hall. It had been around for a while as the Order of St. Tammany, and St. Tammany supposedly was an Indian. We don't know. But he set up the first democratic political machine in the country in New York. And Hamilton was not in it. Hamilton went on with his law practice and fathering 7 children by Betsy. But one summer, he stayed in Philadelphia, the temporary capital, and Betsy went up to Albany, to Stillwater with her father and family. And Hamilton got distracted by a beautiful young woman who told him a sad story of running out of money and not being able to get home. And he said he'd lend her the money, and she came to he came to her rooming house that night, and she thanked him. And she went on thanking him for 15 months as Hamilton drew down the funds in his law practice to almost nothing. At the same time, Hamilton was very fond not only of his wife, but of her older sister. So I've been able to sort of decode their correspondence, basically, that they use punctuation, really, to give it all away. But he had a long-distance relationship with Angelica Schuyler Church, who was married to a British politician. This becomes important in a few minutes. So Hamilton was busy. He had a little time in the summer of 1787 to go to Philadelphia, where they were trying to come up with a new constitution. He was very impatient with the long-winded debates. He needed to get back to his law practice. He stood up only once at length, and he spoke for 6 hours without notes. And he laid down the entire framework of the United States government. Branches of legislation, judiciary, executive, balance of powers, etc., etc. That is the creation. Well, they didn't agree with it right away, but it's what was left when it was all over. Hamilton's 6-hour speech. And then back to New York to work in his office. And we know he was in the office sometimes because when Prince Talleyrand, who was in exile from the French Revolution, walked by Hamilton's office one night and looked in, there was Hamilton at midnight, burning literally the midnight oil, working on cases. Well, maybe he was safer inside because when he came out, from time to time he was attacked by Tammany Hall partisans. He was actually showered with stones one night, opening a nice gash in his forehead. So you can see these two political rivals are getting a little more violent. Now, we wouldn't know about Hamilton's famous affair with Maria Reynolds, except that Jefferson and Monroe and Adams, the Federalists, thought they had the goods on Hamilton as Secretary of the Treasury because someone was fiddling the books. It wasn't Hamilton, it was his assistant, who was the husband of Maria Reynolds, his mistress. And Hamilton had to make the choice between going public with a financial scandal to clear his name or going public with his private affair. And since he had set up his own newspaper, which still exists, the New York Post, to push his political agenda, he told the Maria Reynolds story that he wrote himself in his own newspaper. And that was the end, really, of his political career. There wasn't much sympathy from other people in his own party. But he didn't know that. He didn't know it was over yet. So when Washington's second term was up and Adams became president, the lines were drawn again. The two men couldn't stand each other. Our founding fathers didn't get along. I hate to tell you, it was a red-headed league for one thing. Washington, Hamilton, and Jefferson, we only see them when their hair turned white, but they were all redheads. And they had their offices cheek by jowl with each other in Philadelphia. Every kind of stress and strain. But Hamilton just couldn't stand Adams. And he did everything he could to undermine Adams' presidency. Adams couldn't stand Hamilton, so he pushed through the Alien and Sedition Acts, which really were censorship of the press and of any kind of publishing or any speech or talk against the administration. I'm sure our presidents since then have all wanted to reenact that from time to time. And the specific target was Alexander Hamilton. 25 publishers and printers were arrested and put in jail, given heavy fines, before the act was repealed at the end of Adams' presidency. And Adams became the first one-term president because of Hamilton. Hamilton worked against Adams even if they were both Federalists, just to give you more of the climate. And Adams lost, and he never forgave Hamilton. So now we're up to the early 1800s, and Burr has become vice president pretty much by default, and they're getting ready for the 1804 election. Hamilton is out of office, and he's backing his father-in-law, General Schuyler, who wins a seat in the Senate. Burr wants to be the governor of New York. And at dinner one night, Hamilton, sitting with friends, happens to make the comment that Burr had a bad character and was not fit for office. That's all it took. That's all it took under the Code Duel. Somebody at the table wrote it up, it got in the local newspaper, Burr found out about it, he issued a challenge, Hamilton wouldn't retract, they each chose seconds, it went on and on and on. They finally got together for a political dinner, they couldn't help being at the same table at Tammany Hall. Hamilton jumped up on the table and gave a speech. It was his last speech, he just didn't know it yet. Burr was sitting down and thinking about it. On July 11th, 1804, Hamilton would not retract his comment. The seconds were chosen. Each man rowed across, R-O-W-E-D, to New Jersey, because dueling was already illegal in New York. And there on a narrow slice of cliff, the Weehawken Heights, about 6 feet wide, they were almost as much peril of falling off a cliff as hitting each other. When Hamilton got there, Burr was already there. By being there early, he managed to put the sun in Hamilton's eyes. It was a brilliant morning, early in the morning. Burr, by the way, had been practicing marksmanship for 2 weeks. Hamilton had been writing letters and notes to his wife just in case he were killed, but he had told his seconds and his friends he had no intention of shooting Burr. But he had to go through with a ritual. You had to take 3 turns. You had to take 3 turns until someone was hit seriously, or killed, or retracted. So we have Hamilton arriving. This is not the scene, but this is what it typically looked like. He arrived on the cliff. They walked off 10 paces. Now, I thought it'd be dramatic if I walked off 10 paces in here, but I'd walk off camera and it would ruin things. Or maybe it would improve them, I don't know. But 30 feet from here, if you're in the back row, I think you're probably 30 feet away. Now, that doesn't seem like much of a shot. But Hamilton put on a long cape. You can see that's one thing. You wore a long coat, or Hamilton put on a long cape. Now, Hamilton was a slender man, but what he hoped to do was make himself look even more slender. So he put on a long cape and turned sideways to make himself even less of a target. The problem was, and he didn't know it, we'll come back to those. The problem was he had borrowed the wrong pistols. He didn't have his own dueling pistols. He borrowed them from his brother-in-law, who was the husband of his mistress. Now, these were very specially made pistols. They had a hair trigger. How do we know this? Gun experts didn't figure this out until the 1980s. The pistols still exist. They're in a private collection in New York City. But on analyzing, they found that it had a hair trigger, that if it were set, the slightest movement and the gun would go off. So you didn't have to take much of an aim, you just swung that thing around and it went off. But if it weren't set, you would have to take the time for a very deliberate pull on the trigger. Hamilton had the hair triggers on, as it turned out. Burr got off the first shot. We know from the witnesses. Burr got off the first shot, and the bullet went through the cape, through Hamilton's side, sliced through his liver. He knew right away that he had been to medical school for a while anyway. He knew already that this was a fatal wound. His pistol, when it went off, shot some leaves off a tree above him, which they found when they examined the site later. So Burr won the duel. Hamilton was carried down from the cliff and put in a boat and rowed over to New York City, where he died painfully. It took about 36 hours. But in that 36 hours, you get all the drama of that time. Here we have a man who thought he was going to run for president in the next election, and here you have another man who was vice president and assumed he was going to be president. And they settled it with pistols. Neither man wound up being president. Aaron Burr had to escape from New Jersey. And being Aaron Burr, he didn't go back to New York. He went to Washington and presided over the U.S. Senate. Bold as brass. He was vice president. But New Jersey, for the first time, indicted a duelist for murder, Aaron Burr. So Aaron Burr had to leave to avoid a warrant, and he left the country for 11 years. He didn't plan for 11 years, but he didn't plan on the War of 1812 either. He happened to be in Europe visiting other people who weren't well thought of in America, like William Franklin, the loyalist son of Benjamin Franklin. He went around, and he couldn't get back when the War of 1812 began. And in fact, the story of his Odyssey became the best-selling novel of the mid-19th century, The Man Without a Country, by Edward Everett Hale. That's really Aaron Burr's story. So Burr stayed in Europe till the War of 1812 was over, and came back and opened up a law practice in New York City, and found a very rich old lady and married her. And if you want to know all the juicy details, read Burr by Gore Vidal. We don't have time. I want to go back over a few more, because this wasn't the end of dueling just because there was an indictment. Here's Hamilton's monument, by the way. It's at Trinity Churchyard, headquarters of the firefighters on 9/11. It was seriously damaged and covered with ash and other material. So it's now being restored. But he was laid to rest there. After a wonderful eulogy by Gouverneur Morris, who wrote the preamble to the Constitution, "We the people of the United States," everyone was there. It was a sad affair, and Hamilton had no money. They had to pass the hat to bury him. He was so poor. The first treasurer of the United States did not line his pockets. Aaron Burr came back and practiced law for a very long time. Here he is about 20 years after the duel. When he died, was buried next to his family, because he was the grandson of the founder of the former president of Princeton University. So Aaron Burr is buried at Princeton. You can visit his monument. But the tragedy was these were two great families. And they were caught in this medieval code of honor that their times were closer to the Middle Ages than they are to ours. A man, if he didn't defend his character and his reputation, couldn't possibly get or hold public office or public trust. They hadn't come up with any other system. So the killing went on. Here's one of the great war heroes of that period, Stephen Decatur. Leaped onto a ship in Tripoli Harbor, an American ship, set it on fire, blew it up to Philadelphia in the Tripoli Wars to keep it from being used by the Tripoli pirates against the American merchant marine. Here in the background of this shot, you can see some reference to the shores of Tripoli, which are immortalized. That act is immortalized in the Marine Corps hymn. But Decatur hated his commanding officer, a Commodore James Barron, who had been his boss in the Mediterranean Wars. And Barron had the misfortune of sailing out of Newport News, Virginia in 1807 on a ship that was attacked by the Leopard, a British ship, and he surrendered after a short battle. And that really led to the War of 1812, but the head of the court-martial was Stephen Decatur, his former subordinate officer. And the court-martial convicted Barron of cowardice and neglect of duty. So he was stripped of his command. And he went off to Europe. Apparently, if things didn't work in America, you went to Europe, just as if they didn't work in Europe, you came to America at the time. So Barron went and came back after the war, and Decatur was an even greater hero. And he would not reinstate Barron. He would not let him have his commission back. He wouldn't let. Barron had lived with no back pay for 8 years. And finally, Barron decided that he would call out Stephen Decatur. So there's a monument to the duel in Bladensburg, Maryland, which is a name you might hear more in this centennial of the War of 1812, because it's where the American army ran away from the British army, which was on its way to Washington to burn it the next day. So it's so odd to have this fatal duel that killed Stephen Decatur, the great war hero who would survive the Tripoli Wars, who would survive the War of 1812. He's killed by his former commanding officer in a duel in Maryland in 1820. So in these pictures, you can get more of the story. There's actually a dueling ground in the upper right-hand corner, and every city seemed to have one. Oh, here they even have monuments to them. Here's where the place where a duel took place between Henry Clay, Secretary of State of the United States, Speaker of the House of the United States, and John Randolph of Roanoke. They didn't like each other. Randolph was a senior senator who brought his dogs into the Senate chambers. And Henry Clay thought that was boorish. So Henry Clay ordered that there could be no more dogs during the legislative sessions. That bothered Randolph for about 10 years until he insulted Clay on the floor of the Senate. And Clay called him out. It was just too much. So they challenged each other to duels, and here's the spot in Virginia. Well, they settled it at the last minute. So Henry Clay didn't kill Randolph, and Randolph didn't kill Henry Clay. But Virginia's so proud that there was a duel that they put up a state historical marker at the spot. Here's New Orleans, which had a legendary dueling ground. They needed their own big park. It was so frequent. And this is so hard for us to imagine, something like this that went on and on and on. This code, this. But when Southerners went on vacation in Cape May, the first seaside resort, they practiced with live ammunition on the sand dunes. You never knew. You had to be ready. And dueling really went on till the 1840s. Mostly it stopped then because of a religious revival, the Second Great Awakening, which is also the birthplace of the women's movement, and put together the clergy and the women, and finally there was the political will and the muscle to make dueling this terrible thing from the past. A few would go on. The last duel of anybody public, basically, well, no, sorry to disappoint you. Well, I'll have to tell you. A federal judge and a senator in California decided that they would have a duel. The problem was California came into the Union with a law against dueling. What to do. So a federal judge and a senator decided that it was okay to do it on federal property. So they went inside the presidium and shot at each other. These things die hard. Everybody in the country practically was armed before the Civil War was over. Either they, like John Wilkes Booth, carried a little derringer in their vest pocket, or if they went west after the war, they carried sidearms, pistols. It was a booming business. Duels were a commonplace in the Old West. And when we hear our Western lore, maybe we think it's a little fictitious, but it's not. Dueling went on, and it's celebrated in our history. Doc Holliday, the OK Corral, High Noon, the big movie of the Cold War, is about a duel and how to think about it. Should the man go on his honeymoon with Grace Kelly? Or should he shoot a bank robber who's just gotten out of jail? What drama. Do not forget me, oh my darling, on this my wedding day. He's already saying goodbye because Gary Cooper didn't know what a good shot he was. So our literature, our film, our history are full of this idea that one-on-one combat can solve things. So when the time comes that next month, it's 2014, and the national circus of politics starts up again, it could be worse. They could be calling each other names. Maybe they have a lot more money behind them and they could pay for their own funerals. But I think we've become a little more civilized. We still haven't figured out how to get rid of one gun for every American. That's what we have now. But it's a bad idea, it's illegal to settle your differences at the barrel of a gun. So I didn't mean to come and make a pleading about the Second Amendment, but there we are. We have a history of shooting it out. And right on down to Dick Cheney, he didn't mean it. He really didn't mean it. I don't want to go political. But our presidents can shoot. Our president today can shoot. He may go to Camp David or down into the basement of the White House where there's a target range. You may wonder why it's there. But we are a nation of arms. And we've lost some great leaders because of it, including Alexander Hamilton, including Stephen Decatur. The list goes on and on. But I would like to think that just being able to sit here without anybody calling me out, we as a country have made a lot of progress. Thank you very much. I'd be happy to try to answer any questions that you have. The law was after the fact. They shot at the same time, but Hamilton was hit first and didn't have the strength even to pull, and the hair trigger was off. And he didn't know that as they rowed him across the river. The gun was in the boat next to him, and he warned his second not to touch it. The hair trigger was on. So he didn't even understand what was going on at that point. I'm supposed to repeat questions. That's about 4 parts. I'll try to do the last part that I remember better, and that is, how do we change our political ideas? I'm not altogether sure we have, but we have more laws. And over time, we've met emergencies and crises with popular opinion, which then translates into public action most of the time, eventually. If you look at the amendments to our Constitution, if you studied our Constitution backward through the amendments, you would have a list of how our history unfolded, correcting one flaw or evil after another. So after Burr shot Hamilton, the Constitution was changed. And it wasn't about the duel, but it made it impossible for a vice presidential candidate to say he was a presidential candidate. It corrected a flaw in the Constitution that said that they ran as a ticket. But that was a big flaw. Aaron Burr was entitled under the Constitution. He was a good lawyer to challenge Jefferson and say, I'm the president if I win the Electoral College, whether you think I'm vice president or not. And it goes on and on. We have a Bill of Rights that was not in the Constitution. It's important, I think, to understand that our Constitution set up our government. It did not give us our rights. And from trial and error over 200 years, we have amended those rights and amended those rights and added to them. And eventually we've solved some very big problems that way, like Amendment 13, freeing the slaves, 14 and 15, making them citizens, giving them the right to vote, women getting the right to vote. No president can serve more than 2 consecutive terms. Every one of those was correcting a flaw. So people put pressure on politicians to change the laws to correct the flaws, and I think that's what gives us hope and helps to change our ideals. So it's a good question. Well, he went to Europe for 11 years. Subsequent life of Aaron Burr. He went to Europe for 11 years and he came back and set up law practice in New York City, and he lived a long time. He lived into his 80s. He was a successful lawyer. He was a wealthy man. He was a socialite. And he was a pariah to a lot of people. And it never seemed to bother him. I can't tell you much more than that. He was a New York lawyer for a very long time. But he never held another high office. And he was regarded as a felon. So, New York often is one of the first states to change the laws. So dueling was already illegal in New York, which is why they rode over to Weehawken in New Jersey, which was a famous dueling ground where New Yorkers went. They just weren't the first to go there. You could see the dueling ground as you came out of a tunnel, but you'd be rear-ended. It's not a very good tourist spot. But it's a narrow strip of a cliff. And it was done in secret, basically. Everybody knew about the secret, but it was legal in New Jersey until Aaron Burr. It was legal almost everywhere until the 1840s, when the North had sort of a spiritual reawakening and got rid of debtors' prisons, dueling, and started the women's movement. So a big period of reform. It was legal all the way through the Civil War. A lot of Confederate officers shot each other. And then veterans crossed the Mississippi and went west and continued shooting each other until they started shooting all the Indians. So, it's lawless, but the laws only change slowly. The problem with proof is who are the witnesses. The witnesses that say Burr shot first were Hamilton second, and vice versa. But we're now in an age of criminal forensics where we can examine evidence and get beyond the who struck John kind of testimony, because both sides blame the other. I was at the New York Historical Society on the anniversary of the Duel, and we actually had the Burr family on one side and the Hamiltons on the other. And they got along famously. But they're among the people that believe that Burr was a better shot and Hamilton had the wrong gun. And I think the hair trigger settles it for me. The fact that he still didn't know that it wasn't on, even after he was shot and he's in the boat. So it's a matter of opinion in some respects, but the forensic evidence is that Burr got off a shot and Hamilton couldn't have because of this stiff trigger. So that's the best I can do. I'm not a descendant of either of them. I'm totally impartial and a man of, I can be persuaded. Yes? It happened in 1858, and it was not the last duel, but it was the last one involving high officials that we know about. And that's just on the eve of the Civil War. But it was illegal in California. But it apparently was not illegal in the United States. In other words, it wasn't illegal under federal law. So they were both lawyers, and they knew all you had to do was step across a fence and was still permissible. Today, I don't know how the law would read it. I don't think it would be a state crime, if I'm not mistaken. It would not be a federal crime. But maybe we still haven't solved it. Maybe it ought to get going with the petition. Neither. What a waste. What a waste to the country. So I don't think they were justified. I think Hamilton, there's a little more to this psychologically. We don't have all the time in the world, but his son, using the same pistols, had died in the duel 2 years before, defending his father's honor. Now, if Hamilton knew what pistols his son was using, why in the heck would he borrow them? Was he suicidal? Some people think yes. But we can't know what was in his mind. His political career was over because of the Maria Reynolds affair. It's hard to tell. I think there's evidence that he was clinically depressed. He built a home, the Hermitage, it's now a National Historic Site. And he had his daughter keep playing the same melancholy tunes on the harpsichord day after day after day after his son was killed. So the more we know, the less we know, basically. Were politicians less, or were they afraid to express their opinions for fear of being challenged? They dueled enough that I'm not sure that's true. But you've hit on something, like our most famous traitor is Benedict Arnold. He had to flee the country after the revolution was over. He went to England. There, the Duke of Richmond, a member of the House of Lords, made a reference to his treason. And Benedict Arnold called him out in a duel, a member of the House of Lords. And Arnold's wife had been through so much, she was petrified that he would go through with this. And he actually said to her to stop talking to him about it. Here's the phrase, "You will unman me." Dueling was the ultimate macho. So it depends on the personality, I guess. The politicians had other ways of dealing with each other. They still do, by insult. I had the cartoon of a couple of women dueling, but mostly it's men. And it's this idea that their honor can only be upheld by physical combat. Most of the damage done now is economic. Depriving people of the means to go on with their political careers. We just have other weapons, other forms of victims. I'm not in favor of drones. We have enough in Congress, I almost said. All right, I'm going to thank you very much for your interest in